Shalom. First and foremost, I want to give all praises and honor and glory to Yahweh, Bahashem, Yahushai, Bahashem, Rechak Wadash. Double honors to the apostles, the elders of Great Millstone, who were well. peace and mercy to the Tazadak Akim out there that's laboring this truth with all sincerity. I'm the brother Thamayim, back again with another lesson. It's going to be a quick lesson through the spirit and power of Yahweh Shem Yahushua. And I had another, topic lined up. But through the spirit, while I was driving back to my yard at work, it was just something the spirit just hit me to, go into, restraining from your lust. All right. And when it inspired me to do this lesson, all right, why it came upon my mind is just, I'm just scrolling through my social media and, I'm seeing women, showing their ass, things of that nature. Not going to be too explicit, and then it just came to me. I'm like, one of the most powerful things that the Lord could bless a man with is controlling his lust. Okay, restraining from his lust, because, a man's lust, it could lead him to fall out, or could lead him to do something, could lead him to the dark side. Because when you're going after your lust, you're not going after the spirit. Okay? So I'm gonna bring this out. This is gonna be a quick topic. All right, through the spirit. So this is the book of Matthew, chapter 26, verse 41. And this is Yahweh Shah speaking. It says, "Watch and pray that ye enter not into temptation." So we have to watch and pray. Now we have to watch for the, obviously, we watching, the current events in the world, all right, linking up with the prophecies. But we also got to watch and be circumspect of our own selves, all right, because the scriptures speak about, examining yourself, okay? So we have to watch, how we moving in the spirit. You watch yourself, give yourself a deep, a deep examination, all right? So it says watch and pray. So we have to pray constantly. That's why the scriptures speak about pray without ceasing. Because right now we dwell in the valley of the shadow of death. All right, we got all these different type of spirits, out there in the world, out there in these cities and out there just in general. All right, because we know we're fighting a spiritual battle. Okay, that's why the book of Ephesians, the 6th chapter, goes into putting on that whole armor, which we're going to get into. So, it just came to my mind. So it says, watch and pray that ye enter not into temptation. Now, the word temptation means, things that pull you astray from the Most High. So you have to pray to the Lord that we don't enter into things that could pull us away from him. So that's the reason why you have to restrain from, your lust, because your lust could pull you away from Yahweh Shem Yahushua. All right. And, always move circumspect. If everything is done in balance. Okay. Sometimes you got to feed the flesh. All right. But in balance, you don't want to overly do anything, overly consume yourself. Even what you watching, you don't want to overly consume, darkness. The things you watch, you could be watching. A man could watch, for example, his TikToks, his Instagram, music videos. You don't want to be overly consumed with that. All right. Because those things that got spirits on it as well. When you listen to music, it got a certain vibration to it. It got a frequency to it. We got demonic frequencies. Okay. So you have to always, pray to the Lord that you don't enter into temptation. Okay. But with praying, you have to apply yourself to do those things. You shouldn't be going into parties every single day. And I'm not speaking about no brother, it's just coming to my mind, just give an example. You shouldn't be overindulging, whether it's liquor, parties, women, all right, even food. Okay, too much sugar, could end up causing health problems, So you have to pray to the Lord that you don't fall into things that could pull you away from him. It says the spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. So the spirit is willing, like Paul, like when we read the book of Romans, the 7th chapter, Paul goes into that. Matter of fact, I'm gonna get it real quick. I want to read it in the blue letter. Real quick, and I'm gonna just run through it, skim through it. Okay. So Romans 7. All right. Hold on. Where is it at? Sin that dwelleth in me. I know that's in. Yep. So this is Romans chapter 7, verse 17. I'm going to read it in the A&P. So it says, so now if that is the case, then it is no longer who do it, the disobedient thing which I despise, but the sin nature which lives in me. All right. We have that sin nature that lives in us. This is why, when we go into the, Lord willing, we are the elect and we, be joint heirs with Yahweh Shah. But the first thing when we go into those chariots, Lord willing, we get delivered, is that transformation of the body, All right, because we're not going to enter into the chariots with these mortal bodies. Our bodies are going to be changed into, to be perfect. Okay, we're going to have those fleshly hearts. All right, and not that stony hearts. All right. So it says, but the sin nature which lives in me, we have that sin nature, all right, which always, the flesh is always willing to go off, always, constantly, It says, for I know that nothing good lives in me, that is in my flesh, my human nature, my worldliness, my sinful capacity. For the willingness to do good is present in me, but the doing of good is not, all right. So the present of wanting to do good, is in him, but in us, but our flesh is just weak. Sometimes we do the opposite of what the spirit is, willing to do. For example, lessons. You might want to do a lesson, all right, and your flesh is just pulling you away. Like, I'm gonna just scroll on social media. I'm gonna just talk to my woman. It's always things that's pulling you away from the spirit. But you want to do a lesson. You want to, read and study. But there's that this weak flesh is always pulling us away. So that's the reason why we constantly got to pray to the Lord to keep that Holy Spirit upon us, and to apply, to be more, be more of a doer. I did that in my last lesson. Okay. It says, verse 19. For the good that I want to do, I do not. I do not do, but I practice the very evil that I do not want. All right. So, that's the point there, backing up, what Yahweh Shah was saying, going into the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Okay. So, because this is a spiritual battle. So let's get the book of Ephesians chapter 6 to prove that. All right. Verse, I'm gonna start from verse 11. It says, put on the whole armor of the Most High, that ye may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. All right. So how do we put the whole armor? The whole armor is these scriptures. All right. We have to put on the whole armor of the Most High, which is these scriptures, and praying to the Lord. All right. It says that we may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil, going into the trickery. All right. But the point is, verse 12, it says, for we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. So this is the point. We're fighting against us. It's a spiritual warfare. You got the demon angels, and you got the righteous angels. Okay, reeling to and fro on the earth. Okay, and our flesh attracts that demonic, those demonic things. Our flesh, not our spirit. Our flesh wants to do wrong, but our spirit always wants to do good. So it's a constant warfare. Constantly, we constantly battling against spiritual, principalities. Okay, it's not only a physical thing; it's a spiritual thing, man. People, brothers be having, weird ass thoughts. That's your flesh, man. Brothers get lazy. It's just it's so many things that I can mention. So this is how you combat it. This is the book of Galatians, chapter 5, all right, verse 16. It reads, "This I say then, walk in the spirit, and ye shall not fulfill the lust of the flesh." So we have to walk in the spirit. All right. How do we walk in the spirit? By applying the scriptures, the wisdom, knowledge, and understanding of these scriptures. All right. By constantly reading. All right. Praying. All right. Fasting. All right. This is how we walk in the spirit. Listening, pouring your mind, being occupied in prophecies. Going into the secular history, just, doing spiritual things. Okay? So we won't fulfill the lust of the flesh, being occupied in the things that the Lord wants us to be occupied in, which is this truth. All right? Because when you're so busy, reading, studying, other things, or even practicing, fasting, not only fasting from food, but fasting from sex, fasting from liquor, fasting from the things that you actually like to do, fasting from listening to certain music. All right, this is how you be able to, restrain from your lust and conquer your lust, conquer your flesh. It says, for the flesh lusteth against the spirit, and the spirit against the flesh, and these are contrary the one to another, so that ye cannot do the things that ye would. Like I mentioned before, it's a spiritual warfare. The flesh wars against the spirit. All right, because the flesh is what is pulling you down. You might want to you might want to open up your Bible and read. You might want to do a lesson. Okay, you might want to do spiritual things. You might want to turn on a good frequency music. Read your scriptures. Read your go into words, study your Hebrew. But the flesh always is pulling you away. You might want to, I'll do it later. Procrastinating spirit come on you. I'll do it after I eat. I do it. That's the warfare right there. Well, that's why, the apostles always say, just press the button. Okay? So the point is, to walk more in the spirit. All right, so you can restrain, you can restrain from your lust. Okay? And with that, I want to give all praises and honor and glory to Yahweh Shem Shah. And with that, Shalom.